presenting today is research in psychology, basically providing a focus on the natural methods and also the sort of like agreed upon methods that has been suggested by many scholars of psychology, both in the West and also within the sort of like the Eastern, especially the Muslim perspectives as well. And on top of that, what I hope to share is that how we can actually integrate especially hopefully the Tawhidic paradigm, the soulful knowledge as well, and also the divine knowledge itself, in terms of embedding them in the process of conducting research in psychology itself. Mm-hmm. So beginning with this aspect, whereby of course we need to begin with the idea of why it is important to conduct research in psychology. Now, naturally, the aspect of research is actually about exploring and also identifying new information. And this particular information is the powerful knowledge. And even within Islam, it's been highly encouraged for us to constantly seek out for knowledge itself. And in that regard, in the verse Surah An-Nisa itself, it's been mentioned that Allah bears witness to that which He has revealed to you. He has sent it down with His knowledge, and the angels bear witness as well, and sufficient is Allah as witness. The remark that has been provided here is what has been sent down, what has been revealed to you is the knowledge. Now, the thing is that how is it to us, our purpose of it in this regard is that for us to seek out for it. Research itself and research in psychology itself allows us to have an exploration of this idea, this information that we need, and for us to basically understand further, so that we don't only understand ourselves, we also further understand the creation and the creator, the ultimate creator, and hopefully will bring us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The content focus that I have today, basically, that I'm going to communicate about psychology and the values of psychology itself, why do we need to have a research, and then how do we conduct research by fostering the skeptical mind, the current available methodologies, and the relevant research topics that we can actually focus on, not just from the Western perspective, but also from the Islamic perspective itself. Psychology itself can be defined as the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. So there are two facets to it. The first part is actually the behavior aspect. There are many things that we can actually observe. These are basically the outward or overt actions and reactions of the people, such as talking, the facial expressions that we make, the movements that we do day by day. There are many ways we can observe this. We can basically just go out and see it. But of course, there's a scientific approach to it. It's part of us to basically reflect, what do we have to do day to day? Do we eat? Do we sleep? Do we pray? Do we recite the Quran? Do we actually speak of good? Or do we speak of bad things? On the other hand, basically, the other part is actually the opposite of that. That is the mental processes. These are more internal and it's covered. It's hidden. It's basically activity of the mind, thinking, feeling, and remembering. These are basically a reflection of what do we think about on the day-to-day basis? How do we feel? And on top of that, of course, it also encompasses of the spiritual aspect, the personal relations that we have with the divine being, that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator, and also our personal reflection of things that cannot be seen, for example, the hereafter, alam barzakh, and also basically and on top of that, of course, how we basically have the idea that there's also heaven and hell. There are many topics in psychology itself. Alright? The human is basically the main subject. The human is the main subject, and we are basically trying our best to understand whatever it is that the humans do, whatever it is that they think, and whatever it is that they ponder upon. In Western view, of course, there have been suggestions of what do we look at. We look at sensation and perception. How do we feel the things around us, and how do we see them? For example, as we have our eyes, our nose, our tongue basically to test, and our basically skins to basically have a tactile perception. So how do we perceive this? How do we see the fact that there's a butterfly flying? How do we see the fact that the sky is up there? Mhm. And then another one, perhaps we have the human motivation aspect. What drives us? Is it the right driver? Are we being driven by our own desires, our own us, or our intellectual mind? How does it lead us to do things that are either wrong or right? We also have the focus of mental health. Basically, this is the most common topic that has been discovered and also discussed by many scholars, as well as now it's been an item of communication in our day-to-day life, because how important is the realization that mental health has a severe impact. It's no longer a taboo topic, but rather something that people have been raising for the purpose of awareness. And we have the conscious and unconscious facets of human mind, which is actually interesting because despite the fact that psychology being a scientific field that is actually trying to observe what is rather what we consider as tangible, what we consider as something that we can study about, but there is actually idea about the unconscious, including how do we speak, and also the fact that there might be parts of it that can never be seen or be observed itself, but yet how do we study them? How do we study the spiritual relationship that we have with the Creator? How do we study the social connection that we have with others? How do we study kindness? How do we study what do you call that? Anxiety? How do we study what else do we sorry, pardon me. How do we study envy? How do we study memories? We can also study about the thinking mind, intelligence, language, and also finally, understanding about human as social beings. Again, this is about our interpersonal relationships with other creators of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are the various topics within psychology. Each of them holds important in our understanding of psychology and also our understanding of Islam itself. Without the understanding of the creator and the creation, the purpose itself, none of this would hold any values to us. The values of understanding this can actually be interpreted in two from my perspective. Number one is understanding. Number two is improvements. Understanding is in regard to understanding for the understanding what we are, who we are, and why we are here. And on top of that understanding, basically our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the creator, understanding us as the creation, as the vicegerent, and understanding everything around us. Because even in the Quran it's been mentioned that the people, if you should be in doubt about the resurrection, then consider that indeed we created you from dust, then from a sperm drop, then from a clinging clot, and then from a lump of flesh. Form and unformed that we may show you, and we settle in the wombs whom we will spell for a specified term, then we bring you out as a child, and then we develop you that you may reach your time of maturity. And among you is he who he is taken in early death, and among you is he who is returned to the most decrepit old age, so that he knows, after once having knowledge, nothing. And you see the earth barren, but when it sent down upon it rain, it quivers and swells and grows something of every beautiful kind. Now, without the knowledge of Islam, we wouldn't understand our purpose here. But without the knowledge of the earth itself and what we can do, the boundaries that we have, we wouldn't be able to understand the creation. We need to basically have both sides of the knowledge, and basically through research, which is the main purpose eventually is actually to uncover the knowledge itself, uncover the true knowledge about us, what we are capable of, what we should do, what we shouldn't do in this world, especially guiding us ultimately to death and of course for the hereafter. All right, that understanding is incredibly powerful. Besides that, what do we do with the knowledge that we have basically embed within us? We have to put it into practice. So therefore, improvements is what we need. And so those who are given knowledge and may know that it is the truth from your Lord and therefore believe in it and their hearts humbly submit to it. And indeed is Allah the guide of those who have believed to a straight path. Eventually, our journey in this world is really about continuously improving ourselves so that we never ever lead ourselves astray from the Sirat al-Mustaqim itself. So therefore, if we are truly the believers, we're not only going to seek for knowledge, but we're going to see how it will eventually put itself to our own benefits, not just in this world, but also in the hereafter itself. So in regards to the psychology itself, of course, aside from the topic, there are actually many fields that actually have their own way of guiding and inspiring what kind of knowledge should we search for, what kind of practice should we focus on. In the origin of psychology, there are various modern perspectives itself. So we have the psychodynamic perspectives, we have the humanistic perspective, we have the socio-cultural perspective, the evolutionary perspective. We have the behavioral perspectives, the cognitive perspectives, the biopsychological perspective, then the soulful perspective. The soulful perspective is actually a reflection of our own department of psychology, the journey that we're trying to embark on that is actually to develop and also expand the science of soul itself. Understanding the fact that we cannot study about human without understanding the fact that we are not just a being. We're not just a being with the physical aspect and the thinking aspect. We're also a being with soul, created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, breathed into us basically the moment when we're in the womb itself. If we were to take into the humanistic perspective, for example, the humanistic perspective believe that the optimistic idea that when as a human being, whatever it is that we do is about the growth, positive growth aspect. For the psychodynamic perspective aspect, they really focus on the fact that a lot of things that has happened in the past and the formation of our unconscious mind leads us to behave the way we do. For example, especially how our parents trained us, how our parents taught us, and basically how we were shaped when we were young, develop this basically unconscious thoughts within us that guides us. So therefore, it's almost as if that we ourselves, do not really have control over ourselves. And in order for us to fully develop, it's basically trying to uncover the unconscious thoughts and bring it to life. We also have the evolutionary perspective. The best way to actually explain the evolutionary perspective is about, of course, it's about the idea that it's again, whereby we ourselves is in denial perhaps of the fact that there is actually a hereafter. Whatever it is that we do is about the survival within this world solely. So we also have this biopsychological perspective, cognitive perspective, and behavioral perspectives. All of these, they are rather limited. They are limited in their explanation. For example, the behavioral perspective focus on the fact that there's no cognition, there's no internal, there's no unseen aspect. You can only focus on the fact that things that we can actually see what people do. Cognitive perspective basically have a focus expansion on the fact that there's the thinking mind as well that we can look at indeed. Biopsychological perspective basically combine between how there's the human biology, but also of course the other facets of human that we can actually see, how our neurons, our nervous system itself can be highly influential to what we do on a day-to-day basis. But they're all rather limited actually. The way that they guide eventually, the expansion of knowledge itself is really having a heavy focus on how do we survive in this world and how do we move forward within this world itself. But there's a lot of denial about the soul aspect and how the unseen itself is greater than about the thinking mind. The unseen itself, the relations that we have with the creator and how our purpose as a creation eventually would guide us with what we do, how we think, and eventually allow us to have a full-grown understanding. Within the goals of psychology, if we were to basically expand further, leading us to the discovery of knowledge itself, the goals of psychology, especially research in psychology itself, is to describe what is happening, to explain why is it happening, to predict will it happen again, and to control and manipulate possibilities for change. Integrating that with Islam. So when it comes to it, right? When it comes to the research aspect, for all of those to explain, to predict, to describe, and then to control, manipulate, if we integrate that, basically it's really about us, like, making sure that despite us wanting to know what the human is, it's not that simple, or neither is at that definite version. Eventually, in Islam, research in general is for the purpose of obtaining hidayah, divine guidance. We are here to know the Creator and the purpose of creation. Learning about human beings, like, how we behave, what we do, etc., can deepen that. But we need to do that with caution. The research methodology itself allows the progress of knowledge, making sure it's the right knowledge. Because sometimes what happens is that whatever has been discovered before, maybe perhaps there are areas for improvements. There might be alternative opinions. And therefore, we need to ensure that the knowledge that we have using the scientific approach itself, making sure that we are uncovering the truth, and especially those that are beneficial to the divine truth. We also need to make sure that we separate knowledge that misguides us and focus knowledge that brings us towards the Siratul Mustaqim itself. We need to ensure that we can differentiate between what is considered as scientific claims and pseudo-scientific claims. For scientific claims, they are actually genuine reason, evidence to support what we perceive as the truth. Whereas for the pseudo-scientific claims, it's basically anything that are rather intuitive, and doesn't have a ground for reason at all. So in the psychology, the scientific approach of knowledge itself, what we do is that we begin with having a question. What should we know? What do we want to know? Do we want to know basically what motivates a person to perform 5 daily prayers? Basically, we want to know, how do we breathe in and out? Alright? Or perhaps we want to know, why do some people have difficulties in managing their mental health while others can? But at the end of the day, the bigger question is that as we develop it, it's basically ultimately to know us as a creation, our purpose, our abilities, the limits that we have, and then also basically our relationship with God itself. So the question should be guided by that. And perhaps based on that, we can basically form a hypothesis itself, making a prediction about, hey, what can we know? What can we predict? Right? What's the possibility? What is basically the limit of us itself? We test out the hypothesis, we draw a conclusion, and then basically we make a report to basically eventually present what is the new knowledge that we can have. To conduct a research in psychology, one of the most important things is that to actually begin with a critical mind. Islam calls us to critically examine all specific information and try to impute a general principle through the process of inductive reasoning, but also deductive reasoning as well. Even in the Quran, it's been mentioned that there are those who listen to what is said and follow the best of it. These are the ones rightly guided by Allah, and these are truly the people of reason itself. And then one of my favorite lesson, from the Quran is that it's actually from the story of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam.
وَإِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ لِأَبِيهِ آزَرَ أَتَتَّخِذُ أَصْنَامًا آلِهَةً إِنِّي أَرَاكَ وَقَوْمَكَ فِي ضَلَالٍ مُبِينٍ وَكَذَلِكَ نُرِي إِبْرَاهِيمَ مَلَكُوتَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَلِيَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُوقِنِينَ فَلَمَّا جَنَّ عَلَيْهِ اللَّيْلُ رَأَىٰ كَوْكَبًا قَالَ هَٰذَا رَبِّي فلما أفل قال لا أحب الآفلين فلما رأى القمر بازغا قال هذا ربي فلما أفل قال لئن لم يهدني ربي لأكونن من القوم الضالين فلما رأى الشمس بازغة قال هذا ربي هذا أكبر فلما أفلت قال يا قوم إني بريء مما تشركون إني وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا من المشركين.
So this is actually a very good example of how in regards to the practice of conducting observation, which is part of a natural method of conducting research itself, and the utility of critical mind in conducting research. Now, both the Western perspective and also from the medieval Islam believes that a critical mind is important. And a critical mind is not just for the scholars, actually. A critical mind should be for all and everyone, actually, especially for those who are attempting to reflect and become closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and also have the desire to actually find the truth and be within the straight path itself. Now, from the verse itself, one of the beautiful journey is that discovering of the truth is by finding out the right and wrong, actually, and slowly it's actually a process itself. It's a process that actually takes patience. It's a process that actually takes effort. All right, and the effort can be rigor, and the effort can be basically prolong itself, but however, it's about not giving up itself, which is a true trait that needs to be had by those who are basically attempting to discover the truth. So critical thinking has been an approach within the intellectual tradition back in the medieval Islam. One of the methods of critical thinking is known as the methods of doubt itself, or the methods of skeptical mind. It's basically a way to ensure that we constantly reflect on what do we know and what do we practice. Now, in psychology itself, it's about us. How have we been behaving thus far? How have we been thinking? What do we know about us? What do we do? Alright, and then it's a constant need of reflection itself. We cannot just accept things wholeheartedly without questioning them. Because if not, basically it's us driving ourselves to the approach of taqlid itself. Taqlid, as we know, is basically assenting to the beliefs of intellectual authorities. Basically, we assume that whatever knowledge that has been passed on to us, that has been given to us from our ancestors and anyone that we know, perhaps we've read about, alright, we assume that is the absolute truth itself. But we do not question its epistemic values. We do not question how basically it might require improvement itself. We do not question that, it might not necessarily be the ultimate thing that will be beneficial for us. Even if it's the truth, even if it's right, but if we don't have a deep understanding of it, how can we just follow without actually properly embedding our knowledge about why is it important to us? By Fakhruddin Al-Razi himself, he mentioned that, for those of you, especially the seekers of knowledge, for those of you who are basically attempting to further expand ideas, providing input for others, you can't believe any current collection of knowledge out there as adequate for you. Because the truth is that sometimes what happens, especially if it comes from mankind itself, it can contain both good amount of good and bad itself. So therefore, if you rely on it just to acquire certain knowledge, for example, you just attend classes, you just read papers, especially if you read current papers from the Western perspective itself, you won't be among those who are successful. Because on the contrary, the student would definitely aspire to gain great knowledge. The one that is actually trying to seek the truth will be someone who is thirsty, as if he has arrived at a mirage. He becomes perplexed by the idea that there's so many ideas out there. There's so many ways to find them as well. And the fact that he might feel as if he could be despaired from the victory of the correct course. Now, this is actually like an extreme view of realizing that maybe it will never be finished. The discovery of knowledge will never be finished. And this is actually a great process itself to humble ourselves and also to realize that if we begin with the mindset that it's always an ongoing journey itself. Whatever it is that we've discovered through the research process that we've conducted, there's always room for improvements itself. So therefore, we might be deprived of the correct course, but doesn't mean that it should ever stop. So in that regard, how do we conduct research? So one of the critical thinking processes is that by basically try to seek and present the truth through the argument process itself. So there are 5 separate methods that has been inspired by the method which Fakhruddin Al-Razi himself have tried to discover information and search for knowledge itself. Beginning with the dialectical method. For the dialectical method is the idea that every position of knowledge, every conclusion that you make is as simple as what motivates human, what makes a person sad, what makes a person angry. Do we have the biological truth? Do we have the ultimate truth, etc.? There are 2 sides of the story at least. Each side might be opposing to one another. What is important is that we can't just say there's only one side of the truth immediately. We can't just go ahead and then embrace or put charge ourselves towards just one side because it's comforting to us. We can't just put ourselves in a spot whereby because we feel like this is something that we've always heard. No, it's about presenting both sides, seeing the benefits, the pros and cons, the way each side has to present itself, and then come to a conclusion to see which one actually holds greater or stronger values. But how do we know the values itself? This is the process of critical examination itself. Try to see the premises and reasoning of the argument. Identify whereby if there is any idea, any explanation, any evidences that they include that would be missing, inconsistent, or there's flaws to it. It doesn't make much sense. So that would be the process of critical examination of both sides of the story. Then, of course, to make sure that we are truly critically examining whatever that we found, any information that we found, make sure that we can also utilize the eclectic approach whereby you make sure that you're not only relying on one sources, you're relying on different sources, different ways of obtaining the knowledge itself. The sources that we can communicate about, I will share after this. And then the next one is the emphasis on reason itself. Whenever there is a position, there's an idea, someone stating that, making a statement, this is the truth. This is what I know. This is what I believe in. This is how I believe it. The importance of sleep for mankind. This is how I know the importance of prayers for man. This is how I know soul actually exists or soul do not exist. What will be the reasoning behind it? There should be a valid explanation for each statement being made when you are trying to present the truth. In the process of research itself, if you're trying to basically present the ultimate truth itself, there should be a line of inquiry, a line of rational thoughts that can basically present this idea that is not just intuitive. There's actually a valid reason with evidences to support it. Then finally, to have the skeptical attitude. The skeptical attitude is not the meaning that whereby you close your mind off of information, but rather you open your mind to alternative interpretation, alternative perspectives, so that you do not seize yourself from discovering the truth, but rather you embark on this journey continuously as if that you realize that you can never be certain that what you have is the absolute certainty, but yet you are always on the discovery period of uncovering the divine and the ultimate truth itself. So as I mentioned just now in regards to how do you find your sources? So this is the methods of research and how they are valuable. Within psychology itself, there are several methods that has been agreed upon and they are commonly utilized and also practiced. Alright, so we have what we call as the descriptive methods, the correlations methods, and then the experimental methods. Of course, these are very much technical in nature and I'm pretty sure some of us have heard it before. Now, regarding the descriptive methods of research in psychology, basically is really about seeing things as is and then making a notation about it. For example, if you want to know how do people deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, how do people actually communicate on a day-to-day basis with someone who is older than them, someone who is younger than them? How do we know a person is Muslim and their practices of Islam itself? Right, under the descriptive methods, we have various other methods alongside with it, such as naturalistic observation, that is, as if you walk out there, perhaps you go to a mall, you go to a mosque, and then you see people as is how they behave, and you make a notation of it. Now we also have the laboratory observation. This is whereby perhaps you have a designated space within your university, within your own institution. You decide that I'm going to put people here with the hope that I can have a better understanding of them, right? And then after that, we also have basically case studies, survey research. And then besides that, we also have basically the correlations method. All right, this is basically for the expansion, of course, whereby you assume that any human behaviors, they exist together, not just one. For example, if we look into mental health, there has been basically assumptions and also research being done to understand the fact that improvement of mental health does not come about just like that. There are many behaviors out there, of a person that can basically inform how to improve their mental health. For example, such as prayers, communication, and strengthening relationship with God. And then, of course, finally, experiment is just another method. So these are basically the basic methods in psychology. But how do we integrate this process? When it comes to embarking on a research, right, we can't just take the psychological process on its own, especially from the Western approach itself. To embed the knowledge of Quran and Hadith in the development of this and discovery of knowledge is actually highly important itself. Sorry. One of the approaches that, of course, the scientific research that we've done, the observed behaviors that we basically have done, utilizing basically the Western approach that have been discovered itself, we try to combine them with the records of revelation itself. Now, it is important that we guide ourselves through the records of revelation itself. One of the key approaches that make sure that we basically have a full understanding and then a deep understanding about the concepts, rules of Islam, the knowledge of the created and the creations itself. There are basic principles in Islam. For example, even within the Maqasid Sharia, whatever it is that we have, for example, the protection of intellect itself, the protection of lineage itself, the protection of wealth itself. All of these are basically important to make sure that whenever we're trying to discover knowledge, it is in line with that. For example, let's talk about the protection of lineage itself. If we were to communicate about the topics of psychology itself nowadays, if we are not guided by the Maqasid Sharia itself, what could happen is that we allow ourselves to conduct research that are completely unethical and discovering the truth that presumably benefits more towards our behaviors and our nature within this world, disregarding the fact that there is actually a divine purpose for us in the hereafter itself. If we actually try to utilize the records of revelation, for example, using the Quran and the Hadith itself, There are many processes that we can do, for example, by using basically excerpts from the Quran. Right? We can begin our research by using excerpts of the Quran to understand things such as ahlak, the fact that there exists our relationship, spiritual relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the idea of critical thinking, the critical mind itself. There are many verses in the Quran that actually spoke of this. What we can do is that we utilize this principle and this knowledge and then integrate it with the approach of psychology itself. That is, for example, you conduct naturalistic observation, perhaps. You conduct survey, perhaps, and query people about this. Ask people about this. How do you experience this? Right? And the approach itself, how do you experience this? You can ask basically through the approach of basic psychological skills. You can also basically ask the approach through interview. And if you were to conduct an observation, just see it. Just see it, how people conduct the the prayer 5 times a day. You see how people actually attend classes and communicate, engage in critical discourses itself, the language that they use, the words that they actually utilize. All of this we can use. So this is basically the natural research methods itself. When we embed it with the records of revelation itself, what it does is that it provides us an idea, it provides us principles, it provides us rules whereby whatever it is that we discover, whatever it is that we find out, eventually, number one, it will basically allow us to basically realize that this is the power of the Creator, our purpose as a creation, and basically the rules and limits and that we have in order to make sure that we never go astray itself. Through the integration process, there are many things that we can basically embark on. We will uncover further the importance of Allah itself. We will uncover further the importance of tadabbur, prayers, among others. When it comes to it, there are more and more actually Muslim psychologists that have embarked on research such as this because they realize that there are many concepts within the Quran itself that you can actually first use to further observe, basically on our day-to-day experience itself, and then make a scientific discovery of it. The scientific discovery, of course, it has the rigorous process of, like I mentioned just now, basically finding out what is your question. Do you want to understand further? Why is prayer important to our physical health or even our mental health? Why is it important that we maintain akhlaq itself? Without these questions, what could happen is that people will basically live a life whereby there is no law, especially the law that should be guiding you to ensure that whatever it is, there is actually benefit for you, there's benefit for others. And on top of that, there's actually a benefit for your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yourself. So my final thought on this is that, of course, begin with a critical mind. And then also, on top of that, that critical mind should be guided properly and then, cautiously as well with the records of revelation. We have the Quran and Hadith to guide us on that. Making sure that at the end of the day, it's about relying on the Tawhidic paradigm, that is the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and understanding that under the Tawhidic paradigm there is Allah the Creator and we are basically the creation, and then among us as well there are other things around us that we can engage and actually interact with to make sure that we are able to understand fully the psychology that is the human mind, and also the mental processes and the behaviors itself that eventually ultimately will be beneficial for us in the hereafter. So that is it actually from my part. Hope we can get started. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Alhamdulillah, it's a very great and very important this this presentation, mashallah. And Doctor, we will open the Q&A. Because I think we can chat in the chat box first, or all participants, you can raise up your hand. If you want to ask the question, you can raise up your hand so that I can unmute you.
There is one question that I saw from Adiyajna Putri. I think this is a good question. I definitely enjoy this. I still do not understand, do research questions in Islamic psychology originate from the Quran and Hadith, which are explained through a psychological point of view, or do they originate from everyday problems which are answered using an Islamic and psychological perspective? When it comes to the emergence of research, so if I can go back to my slide 1 second now, because that's one of the slides. When we're talking about the emergence of the question itself, perceiving the question itself, whether it originates from Quran and Hadith or do they originate from the everyday problems itself, I believe they are both. You can't deny either one. You do not decide to start from the Quran. You can. That's not a problem at all. But sometimes what happens is that perhaps you begin with the pondering, you're like, who is God? Like Ibrahim alayhi salam started with that. Then he make a realization slowly through the discovery of how he observes the world around him, and eventually from the sun and then from the people, and then he made it further the development of the critical mind itself, make him realize that the world led him to the Quran and Hadith. Some places the Quran and Hadith as well lead us to answer the questions of the world itself, and they both should coexist rather than being separated, like one comes first before the other. But what should eventually come to us is basically from the heart itself, that you are actually trying to uncover the truth. This is basically ultimately the thing that is actually missing and in error if you basically separate yourself from the Islamic approaches. I hope that answers the question. How can we differentiate between the Islamic perspective, skepticism, and the Cartesian doubt? I don't think if that is necessary. From the Islamic perspective, if I can mention, right, especially in the deeper understanding of the Islamic perspective as well, when it comes to the method of doubt, of course, it is about really making sure that we are open to the idea that there's possibility, there's the truth out there, and we have not have the full understanding, or we might have the wrong understanding itself. All right. So in regards to the Islamic perspective itself, it's about ensuring that the additional part is that whatever it is that we are doubtful about, we have absolute certainty there is one truth. All right. Tawheed is the truth. That is the ultimate difference. All right. I'm reflecting from the perspective, from Nur Saada. I'm reflecting from the perspective of a Muslim minority living in a secular society, Philippines. I wonder how can we pursue integrative approach to psychology and implement this in our education system? Now that is actually quite a big question as well. I understand because I used to live in what I would say in a community whereby majority of the individuals are non-practicing, and it is indeed a struggle, especially. But one of the things that I learned is that to not allow yourself to isolate yourself, especially as a Muslim, the best approach is that to actually live within the community that actually have practicing Islam itself. I do think that that's actually important itself. But at the same time, to integrate psychology and knowledge, I believe that there are many opportunities whereby you can actually create your own educational group, all right, to implement this in our education system, and then make it clear within that particular educational group whereby the difference between the absence of Islam as the integration of Islam in the spread of knowledge, and also the presence of it, how different it is, and make it a fruitful effort, a seamless and endless effort to make sure that it's always within the mind, because the moment it is absent and there's no effort to ensure continuity of it, people can go astray. There's the forgetfulness aspect. It's as simple as being in the wrong crowd, actually. I hope that helps. It's a complicated thing. I do feel like that's a long discussion, actually, regarding how do we actually allow, living in a secular society, especially if you're a Muslim minority. I don't think it's I wouldn't say it's not problem. I would say it's not impossible. It's been done over and over again. We can see the spread of Islam itself all over the world.
MashaAllah. Thank you very much, Doctor. Very interesting. Inshallah, Doctor. Thank you very much. And we will see you again in the next session, Doctor.
Inshallah. Thank you so much for having me. Assalamualaikum.